She collapsed outside his penthouse at 3 a.m, too exhausted to care if she lived or died. Shin Min-ah had been awake for 42 hours straight, her body running on nothing but desperation and the toxic fuel of betrayal that had been burning through her veins since the moment her stepmother changed the locks. The marble hallway of Seoul's most exclusive residential building felt cool against her cheek as consciousness slipped away, her last coherent thought being that at least she'd finally stopped moving, stopped running, stopped trying to find somewhere that would take her in. The universe had decided this anonymous corridor would be her resting place, and she was too broken to argue. Kang Joon-ho found her when he returned from his late-night office session, his driver having dropped him at the private elevator that led directly to his penthouse floor. At 34, Joon-ho had built an empire in tech security, his software protecting half of Korea's major corporations from cyber threats. He'd survived boardroom betrayals, hostile takeovers, and competitors who'd tried everything short of assassination to eliminate his company. But nothing in his carefully controlled existence had prepared him for the sight of a young woman curled against his door, like an abandoned kitten. Her designer clothes rumpled and stained, her face streaked with dried tears, an exhaustion so profound it looked like death. His first instinct was to call security. Seoul had no shortage of scams, and for all he knew, this was some elaborate setup, a honey trap, an attempted robbery, something designed to exploit the compassion of wealthy marks. But something stopped him from reaching for his phone. Maybe it was the way her hands were tucked under her cheek, like a child seeking comfort. Maybe it was the obvious quality of her clothes despite their disheveled state, suggesting this wasn't her usual condition. Or maybe it was simply that Joon-ho recognized the specific texture of despair that came from having nowhere left to go, because he'd worn that same expression once, years ago, before fortune had smiled on his struggling startup. He knelt beside her, checking for a pulse with fingers that surprised him by trembling slightly. Her heartbeat fluttered weak but steady beneath his touch, and up close he could see she was younger than he'd initially thought. Early 20s at most, with delicate features currently swollen from crying and deprivation. She didn't wake when he gently shook her shoulder, her body's shutdown too complete for easy reversal. Joon-ho made a decision that his rational mind screamed was foolish. He scooped her into his arms, surprised by how little she weighed, and carried her into his penthouse. The guest bedroom had never been used in the 3 years he'd owned this place. Joon-ho laid Min-ah on sheets that still smelled of packaging, removing only her shoes before covering her with a blanket. He positioned a glass of water on the nightstand, left the bathroom light on with the door cracked, and settled into an armchair in the corner to keep watch. If this was a con, at least he'd see it coming. If it wasn't, and something in his gut insisted it wasn't, then this girl needed someone to ensure she kept breathing through whatever crisis had driven her to his doorstep. Min-ah woke 16 hours later to unfamiliar ceiling, unfamiliar softness, and the unfamiliar sensation of safety. Panic hit immediately. Where was she? How had she gotten here? What had happened during the hours her memory couldn't account for? She bolted upright, her body protesting the sudden movement with aches that spoke to days of physical and emotional punishment. The bedroom was clearly expensive, minimalist in that way that required substantial wealth to achieve. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see Seoul's skyline glittering in the afternoon sun, the view confirming she was somewhere very high up, very exclusive, very far from the streets where she'd spent the last 2 days wandering. Joon-ho appeared in the doorway before her panic could fully bloom, his presence somehow both calming and intimidating. He explained in a quiet, measured voice what had happened, finding her at his door, bringing her inside, watching over her while she slept. He asked no questions, made no demands, simply informed her that she was safe, that she could stay as long as she needed, and that food was available whenever she felt ready to eat. The complete absence of judgment or expectation in his words made something crack in Min-ah's chest, and she started crying again, unable to articulate why this stranger's kindness destroyed her composure more thoroughly than her family's cruelty had. The story emerged gradually over the following days, as Min-ah regained her strength and Junho proved himself trustworthy through consistent, quiet support. She'd been the unwanted daughter of a second marriage, tolerated while her father lived but disposable the moment he died 6 months ago. Her stepmother had waited a calculated amount of time before making her move, draining Minna's trust fund through legal manipulations, turning her half-siblings against her with carefully constructed lies, and finally orchestrating her complete removal from the family home. The locks changed while Minna was at her father's grave, her belongings thrown into the street, her phone disconnected, her credit cards canceled. Seoul had always been her home, but without money or family connections, the city had revealed its hostile architecture with brutal efficiency. Friends she'd thought genuine had proven fair weather, their willingness to help evaporating when association with her became socially inconvenient. The few relatives she'd contacted had sided with her stepmother, believing whatever poison had been poured in their ears. Minna had spent 2 days trying to navigate systems designed to catch people before they fell through cracks, only to discover those systems worked primarily for people who already had resources. The final humiliation had come when a shelter turned her away, because her expensive clothes suggested she wasn't truly desperate, as if poverty could only be authentic when it looked a certain way. Junho listened to her story with an expression that shifted from sympathy to something harder, more dangerous. He recognized the patterns she described because he'd seen similar dynamics play out in business. The way sharks circled when they sensed weakness, how systematic isolation preceded financial destruction. Minna's stepmother had executed a corporate takeover strategy on a family scale, eliminating competition for inheritance with ruthless precision. The fact that her victim was a grieving young woman who'd just lost her father made the betrayal particularly vicious. He made Minna an offer that should have seemed too good to be true. Stay in his guest room rent-free until she got back on her feet. Use his address for job applications. Take time to recover before facing Seoul's brutal employment market. In exchange, he asked for nothing. No repayment, no timeline, no expectations of any kind. Minna's first instinct was suspicion, because generosity this pure didn't exist in the world she'd learned to navigate. But Junho's motivation seemed genuinely uncomplicated. He had resources he didn't need, she needed resources desperately, and the transaction cost him nothing while potentially saving her life. Living with Junho revealed layers Minna hadn't anticipated. Despite his wealth, he lived simply. No parties, no revolving door of dates, no excessive displays of the fortune his company generated. He worked constantly, often from home, his penthouse doubling as office space for marathon coding sessions that stretched deep into Seoul's night. He was kind without being intrusive, respectful of her space while ensuring she had everything she needed. He bought groceries without asking what she wanted, somehow intuiting her preferences. He left encouraging notes when he had early meetings. He treated her presence in his home as natural, unremarkable, like she'd always belonged there. Minna found herself healing in ways that transcended physical rest. The constant anxiety that had defined her existence since her father's death began loosening its grip. She started sleeping through nights instead of startling awake at every sound. Her appetite returned, and with it, the awareness that she'd been slowly starving herself through stress. Junho's steady, undemanding presence became the foundation she rebuilt herself upon. Not because he pushed or demanded gratitude, but because he simply maintained space for her to exist without justification. She started contributing to the household in small ways, unable to accept pure charity without offering something in return. She cooked meals when Junho worked late, discovering he survived primarily on convenience store food and energy drinks. She organized his chaotic home office, implementing systems that made his research materials accessible. She proofread contracts and presentations, her economics degree from Yonsei University proving useful despite her stepmother's attempts to discredit her education. Junho accepted her help with the same casual grace he'd offered his home, never making her feel like she was earning her keep, just acknowledging that partnership was more pleasant than solitude. 3 months into their arrangement, something shifted between them. Minna had secured a position at a mid-sized financial firm, Her interview successful partly because Junho's address on her application suggested stability. The job wasn't glamorous, but it was legitimate, well-paying, and offered the independence she'd been desperately seeking. She could finally start rebuilding her life on her own terms. She told Junho about the offer over dinner, expecting him to be relieved that his charity case was finally becoming self-sufficient. Instead, something complicated flickered across his face. Pleasure at her success, mixed with something that looked unsettlingly like loss. The confession came awkwardly that same evening, launched by Korean whiskey and exhaustion after a particularly brutal work deadline. Junho admitted he'd grown dependent on her presence in ways he hadn't anticipated and probably shouldn't admit. Coming home to a space where someone cared if he'd eaten, where conversation waited instead of empty silence, where another human being's gentle existence reminded him that life contained more than code and corporate warfare. He'd become addicted to it. To her. He clarified immediately that she owed him nothing, that her staying had never been conditional on reciprocating feelings he had no right to develop. But he needed her to know before she left that these months had been the happiest of his adult life. Minna's response wasn't immediate, because her own feelings were complicated, tangled in gratitude and genuine affection she'd been afraid to examine too closely. She told herself her racing heart when Junho came home was just relief at not being alone, that her careful attention to his preferences was simple reciprocity, that the way she'd started dressing nicer, styling her hair, wearing subtle makeup was about rebuilding her confidence, not about hoping he'd notice. She'd been lying to herself with the same determination she'd once applied to believing her family loved her. The truth was that Shin Mina had fallen in love with Kang Junho somewhere between the 3rd week and the 3rd month, the exact moment lost in the accumulation of small kindnesses that had slowly rebuilt her shattered faith in human decency. She loved his quiet strength, his complete lack of ego despite having every right to arrogance, the way he treated her brokenness as temporary rather than defining. She loved that he'd given her space to heal without rushing or pressuring, that he'd seen her at her absolute worst and hadn't flinched. Most of all, she loved that he'd expected nothing in return for his generosity, making her feelings genuine rather than obligatory. But she was terrified that her emotions were just trauma bonding, gratitude misidentified as love. Terrified that she'd burden him with expectations after he'd given so freely without strings. Terrified that she'd become another obligation in his life, another person taking from him, without offering equal value in return. Her stepmother had spent months convincing her she was worthless, parasitic, destined to drag down anyone foolish enough to care about her. Those words had burrowed deep, and even 3 months of Junho's kindness hadn't fully extracted them. Junho saw her spiraling and made a decision that was either brilliantly perceptive or devastatingly risky. He told her to take the job, move out, build her independent life. If their feelings were real, for both of them, they'd survive separation and the test of her standing on her own feet. If they were just trauma response and proximity, then distance would reveal that truth without either of them having to acknowledge the mistake. He'd rather lose her temporarily, and maybe find her again on equal footing than keep her in a situation where she'd always wonder if she stayed from gratitude rather than choice. Minna moved into a modest studio apartment in Mapo-gu, her first paycheck covering deposit and rent, with enough left over to begin rebuilding her life. The separation was harder than either had anticipated. She'd text Junho updates about her day, then delete them before sending, uncertain if maintaining contact was healthy or pathetic. He'd start calling her a dozen times, only to stop himself, respecting the boundary he'd suggested, even as it killed him. Seoul had never felt so vast or so lonely as it did during those first weeks apart. The revelation neither of them saw coming arrived in the form of Minna's stepmother's catastrophic legal troubles. The same manipulation she'd used to drain Minna's trust fund had been applied to multiple other targets. She'd been running an elaborate fraud scheme, using her dead husband's business connections and her stepdaughter's identity to secure loans and investments she never intended to repay. When the house of cards collapsed, it collapsed spectacularly, taking down several prominent families and landing her stepmother in prison awaiting trial. The investigation revealed that Minna's trust fund hadn't been legally drained. It had been stolen through forged documents. Her father's will had been altered. Her siblings had been manipulated with fabricated evidence of affairs and betrayals that never happened. The entire foundation of her exile had been built on crimes that prosecutors were now systematically documenting. Minna found herself suddenly the victim in a high-profile case, her name cleared, her inheritance restored, and her stepmother facing decades in prison. The money returned to her in amounts that seemed absurd after months of poverty. Enough to never work again if she chose. Enough to match Junho's wealth. Enough to erase every practical barrier between them. But Minna discovered something important during her weeks of independence. She didn't want wealth for its own sake. She wanted to keep her job because she'd earned it. She wanted her modest apartment because she'd chosen it. She wanted to maintain the life she'd built from nothing, because that life was genuinely hers in ways her previous privileged existence had never been. She went to Junho 6 weeks after moving out, not because she needed rescue or support, but because she missed him with an intensity that had nothing to do with practical considerations. She found him in his penthouse looking as exhausted and miserable as she felt. His home feeling emptier, despite being exactly as it had been before she'd collapsed at his door. They stared at each other across the space where she'd healed, both afraid to speak first, both terrified that time apart had revealed their feelings as illusion. Junho broke first, asking if she was happy. Minna answered honestly. She was proud. She was independent. She was rebuilding herself exactly as he'd enabled her to do. But she wasn't happy, because happiness apparently required his presence in ways that transcended gratitude or circumstance. She'd tested her feelings through separation and discovered they'd only grown stronger, more certain, impossible to dismiss as trauma response. She loved him, not because he'd saved her, but because of who he was. The quiet, brilliant, impossibly kind man who'd given her space to become herself before asking if she'd choose to share her life with him. Junho closed the distance between them in 3 strides, kissing her with months of restrained longing finally unleashed. He admitted he'd been miserable, that his penthouse felt haunted by her absence, that he'd been watching his phone obsessively hoping she'd contact him. He loved her independence, loved that she'd rebuilt herself into someone who didn't need him. Because that meant when she chose him, if she chose him, it would be genuine choice rather than desperate necessity. Minna moved back into the penthouse that weekend, but this time as an equal partner rather than a charity case. She kept her job, maintained her own bank account, insisted on contributing to household expenses, even though Junho found this hilarious given his net worth. But the symbolism mattered to both of them. She wasn't returning to dependence. She was choosing partnership, bringing her whole self, recovered, strong, independent, into a relationship built on mutual respect rather than rescue dynamics. The proposal happened without fanfare, a quiet question during a lazy Sunday morning in the kitchen where Minna was making breakfast. Junho simply asked if she'd marry him, offering no ring, no elaborate production, just the honest question from a man who'd proven through actions that his love was steady, reliable, the kind that showed up even when inconvenient. Minna said yes while crying into the eggs she was scrambling, ruining breakfast but not caring because some moments mattered more than perfectly cooked food. They married in a small ceremony that deliberately excluded Seoul's elite society, inviting only people who'd proven genuine. Minna's loyal university friends who'd quietly supported her during her exile, Junho's small circle of employees who'd become family, the building security guard who'd helped carry an unconscious Minna inside that first night without asking questions. Her half-siblings sent apologetic messages that Minna read and then deleted, forgiveness still too complicated to navigate when the wounds remained fresh. Years later, Minna would stand in the same hallway where she'd collapsed, this time holding her daughter's hand, explaining why this particular stretch of marble was special. She'd tell a sanitized version appropriate for children about how sometimes you have to hit absolute bottom before you can begin climbing back up, about how the kindness of strangers can reshape entire lives. about how the worst moments sometimes lead to the best outcomes if you're brave enough to keep breathing through them. But late at night, wrapped in Junho's arms in the penthouse that had transformed from a lonely bachelor's fortress into a home filled with love and laughter, Minna would remember the complete despair that had driven her to his door. She'd remember believing she had nothing left to lose, that dying in an anonymous hallway was the best ending available to her story. She'd remember the miracle of Junho choosing compassion when cynicism would have been easier, the way his steady presence had given her space to rebuild herself, the way he'd loved her without requiring her to be anything other than exactly who she was. The girl who'd collapsed at his door had been broken, defeated, convinced her value died with her father's love. The woman who now owned half that penthouse and all of Junho's heart had been reborn from those ruins, stronger for having survived them, grateful for the kind of love that didn't demand perfection but celebrated authentic survival.